Lonely rancher Garrett Stone lived 15 years in bitter isolation until a desperate Ponca widow named Itzel Sinning Wolf appeared at his gate with 4 starving children, begging not for food, but for something far more precious, a chance to save her family's sacred burial ground from ruthless land grabbers who would stop at nothing to claim it. The morning sun painted the Nebraska territory in shades of amber and dust, casting long shadows across the Broken Creek Ranch where Garrett Stone had lived alone for 15 years. The silence here was profound, broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle and the whisper of prairie wind through the tall grass that surrounded his weathered homestead. At 42, Garrett had grown accustomed to conversations with his horses and the rhythmic solitude of ranch work, finding a cold comfort in the predictable cycles of dawn and dusk that marked his days.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
His weathered hands gripped the fence. Posty was mending, muscles tensing as he drove the nail home with practiced precision. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw caught the morning light, a permanent reminder of the Apache raid that had taken everything from him in the winter of 1864. His wife Margaret and their twin boys, Samuel and Daniel, had been visiting her sister in Colorado when the attack came. Garrett had arrived 3 days too late, finding only charred ruins and 3 graves that the survivors had hastily dug in the frozen ground. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through his bitter reverie, causing him to straighten and shade his eyes against the sun. What he saw made him reach instinctively for the Colt .45 at his hip, though something in the desperate pace of the approaching riders stayed his hand. A woman rode bareback on a paint horse, her long black hair streaming behind her like a war banner, while 4 small figures clung to her and the horse's mane with the desperate grip of those who had nowhere else to go. As they drew closer, Garrett could see the woman's face more clearly. She was Ponca, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that held both fierce determination and barely contained desperation. Her traditional dress was torn and dusty from hard travel, and the children, pressed against her, appeared thin and hollow-eyed. The oldest boy, perhaps 12, sat straight despite his obvious exhaustion, while the youngest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5, swayed dangerously in her precarious perch. The woman brought her horse to a halt 20 feet from Garrett's fence, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the space that separated their worlds, the isolated white rancher who had chosen solitude over the pain of human connection, and the Ponca widow who carried the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite her obvious exhaustion, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am Itzel Sinning Wolf of the Ponca people," she announced, her English clear and precise despite the faint accent that colored her words. "I seek the man called Stone, who they say keeps his word when others break theirs like dried grass in winter. My children have not eaten in 3 days, but I do not come begging for your charity. I come offering you something worth more than cattle, more than gold, if you have the courage to help us reclaim what was stolen from our ancestors." Garrett's hand moved away from his gun, though his posture remained wary. In his 15 years of self-imposed isolation, he had dealt with drifters, cattle rustlers, and desperate men fleeing the law, but never had anyone approached him with such a mixture of desperation and dignity. The children's gaunt faces stirred something deep in his chest, a pain he had spent years learning to ignore. The oldest boy's eyes held the same protective intensity Garrett remembered seeing in his own mirror after his family's death. "Ma'am," Garrett replied, his voice rusty from disuse, "I don't know what you've heard about me, but I keep to myself. Don't get involved in other folks' troubles, Indian or otherwise. There's a trading post 15 miles south where you might find help." Itzel's eyes flashed with something between anger and desperation. She dismounted in one fluid motion, her bare feet touching the dusty ground with the silent grace of someone raised in harmony with the earth. The children remained on the horse, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope, as they watched their mother face down the scarred white man, who might be their last chance for survival. "The trading post burns," she said flatly. 3 days ago, Preston Langford's men set fire to it because the owner, Thomas Whitehorse, refused to sell them information about our sacred burial ground. They killed him and scattered his family to the wind. Now Langford's men patrol the roads, turning away any Indian who seeks help. You are the only white man for 50 miles who does not dance to Langford's fiddle. The name Preston Langford hit Garrett like a physical blow. He knew the man's reputation well, a ruthless land speculator who had made his fortune by driving settlers off valuable property through intimidation, violence, and legal manipulation. Langford's operations stretched across 3 territories, leaving a trail of broken families and stolen dreams in his wake. What surprised Garrett was learning that the man had turned his attention to sacred Indian burial grounds, a move that spoke of either desperate greed or complete moral bankruptcy. "What's Langford want with a burial ground?" Garrett asked, his curiosity overriding his instinct to turn them away. "Can't be much profit in disturbing old graves." Itzel reached into a leather pouch at her waist and withdrew something that made Garrett's breath catch in his throat. It was a piece of raw gold, roughly the size of a man's thumb, its surface gleaming with unmistakable purity. She held it up so the morning sun could catch its brilliant surface, creating flashes of light that danced across the dusty ground between them. "The burial ground of my ancestors sits atop the richest gold vein in the territory," she explained, her voice heavy with the weight of generations. "For 200 years, my people have kept this secret, honoring our dead by protecting the earth that holds them. But Langford has learned of it through treachery and violence. He has filed false claims with the territorial government, claiming the land was abandoned. In 3 days, he will bring miners and desecrate the graves of my fathers to feed his hunger for gold." The youngest child, a girl with enormous dark eyes, began to sway dangerously on the horse's back. Without thinking, Garrett moved forward and caught her just as she started to fall, her small body frighteningly light in his strong arms. Her skin was burning with fever, and her breathing was shallow and labored. The touch of the sick child brought back a flood of memories, his own boys burning with scarlet fever during their last winter together, Margaret's gentle hands cooling their foreheads with damp cloths. "This one's sick," Garrett said, his voice rougher than he intended. "How long has she been like this?" "Since yesterday," Itzel replied, her composure cracking for the first time to reveal the desperate mother beneath the stoic warrior. "Ayanna has always been delicate, but the hunger has made her weak. She needs medicine, food, rest, things I cannot provide while we run from Langford's men. They hunt us not to kill us quickly, but to let us die slowly in the wilderness while they steal our sacred ground." Garrett looked down at the child in his arms, seeing his own son Daniel's face superimposed over her delicate features. The fever-bright eyes, the labored breathing, the small hands that clutched weakly at his shirt. It was too much like losing his boys all over again. But this time, he had a choice. This time, he could act instead of arriving too late to do anything but dig graves and carry guilt. "The others," he said, nodding toward the remaining children still mounted on the paint horse. "What are their names?" Itzel's eyes widened slightly at the question, recognizing it for what it was, the first sign that this scarred, isolated man might be willing to help them. "Otate, my eldest son, who has been the man of our family since his father died fighting the Bluecoats. Katori, my daughter, who remembers every story of our people and keeps our traditions alive in her heart. Inepe, my gentle son, who speaks to animals as others speak to people. And Ayanna, my baby, whose name means eternal blossom, but who may never see another spring if—" "Come inside," Garrett interrupted, his decision made with the suddenness of a prairie thunderstorm. "All of you." The child needs medicine, and you all need food.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
We can talk about this burial ground business after everyone's taken care of. Itzel stared at him for a long moment, searching his scarred face for signs of deception or ulterior motive. What she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and began helping her children down from the horse. Otakte, the 12-year-old, moved with the careful dignity of someone forced to grow up too quickly, while Katori and Anape leaned against each other for support, their resilience remarkable despite their obvious hunger and exhaustion. As they walked toward his modest ranch house, Garrett found himself acutely aware of how the presence of this family changed the very air around his homestead. For 15 years, these wooden walls had echoed only with his own footsteps and the occasional creak of settling timber. Now the soft murmur of Ponca words mixed with the rustle of worn clothing and the gentle breathing of children who had found, at least temporarily, a refuge from their desperate flight. Inside, Garrett's house revealed the living quarters of a man who had given up on comfort years ago. The furniture was sparse and functional: table, 4 chairs, a single bed in the corner, and shelves lined with ammunition, canned goods, and the practical necessities of frontier survival. But the walls told a different story, decorated with the remnants of his former life: a wedding photograph of him and Margaret, a child's drawing of horses signed by Samuel and Daniel, and a Bible that showed the wear of hands that had once sought comfort in faith. Garrett laid little Iana on his bed, noting how her small body barely made an impression in the mattress. Her fever had worsened during their short walk from the fence, and her breathing had become increasingly labored. From a wooden box beside his bed, he withdrew a bottle of laudanum and a cloth, working with the efficiency of someone who had nursed sick children before. "This will help with the fever," he said, diluting a small amount of the medicine in water. "But she needs real food, something gentle on her stomach. How long since any of you ate?" 3 days, Otakte answered when his mother hesitated, his young voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to hardship. "Mother gave us the last of our dried meat before we reached the river. She has not eaten in 5 days. Garrett turned to look at Itzel, seeing her properly for the first time in the better light of his house. Her face was indeed gaunt with hunger, and her traditional dress, while clean and carefully maintained, showed the wear of constant travel and poverty. Yet she stood with her back straight and her chin raised, refusing to let desperation rob her of dignity. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward his table. "All of you. I'll heat some broth and biscuits. It's not much, but it's better than empty stomachs." As Garrett worked at his stove, lighting the fire and setting a pot of beef broth to warm, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests. The children sat close together, drawing comfort from each other's presence in the way that families do when they've faced hardship together. Katori, the 10-year-old daughter, had taken on the maternal role of caring for her younger brother, Anape, while Otakte kept watch over them all with the protective intensity of someone who had learned too young that safety was never guaranteed. "You," said Langford, killed the trading post owner, Garrett said as he worked, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of food preparation. "That's a serious accusation. You have proof of this?" Itzel reached into her leather pouch again and withdrew a piece of fabric stained with dried blood. "Thomas Whitehorse was my cousin. This is from his shirt, torn when Langford's men dragged him from his store before they burned it. His wife Sarah saw everything from where she hid in the root cellar with their children. She told us the men wore Langford's brand on their belt buckles and spoke of orders from their boss to clean up the Indian problem before the mining operation began." The smell of warming broth began to fill the small house, and Garrett noticed how the children's eyes followed his every movement around the stove. Their hunger was a palpable thing, filling the room with an urgency that made his chest tight with memories of his own boys, begging for food during the lean winter before their deaths. Sarah Whitehorse and her children, Garrett continued. Where are they now? Dead, Itzel replied flatly. Langford's men returned the next morning and finished what they started. They made it look like a Sioux raiding party, even scalped the bodies and left Sioux arrows behind. But Sarah's youngest boy escaped and reached our camp before he died from his wounds. His last words were about the burial ground and Langford's plans to start mining within the week. Garrett ladled the hot broth into bowls, adding pieces of dried beef and day-old biscuits softening the warm liquid. The simple meal looked like a feast to the hungry children, but he noticed that Itzel waited until all 4 of her children had been served before she touched her own bowl. The gesture reminded him of Margaret, who had always fed their boys first, even when food was scarce. Eat slowly, he cautioned as Inepe began to gulp his broth. Your stomachs aren't used to food. Too much too fast will make you sick. As the family ate, Garrett studied the piece of gold Itzel had shown him earlier. In his years of ranching, he had encountered enough prospectors and miners to recognize genuine gold when he saw it. This sample was unusually pure, the kind that would drive men to murder and worse for even a small claim. If there truly was a vein of such gold beneath the Ponca burial ground, Langford would indeed stop at nothing to claim it. You said you could offer me something worth more than cattle or gold, Garrett said, settling into the 4th chair at his table. What exactly are you proposing? Itzel set down her spoon and met his eyes directly, her gaze steady and unwavering. My people have lived in harmony with this land for countless generations. We know every stream that runs clean, every patch of grass that feeds cattle best, every cave that provides shelter from storms. We know which roots heal sickness, which plants bring good fortune to crops, and which spirits guard the places where white men fear to go. She paused to ensure her children were still eating, then continued. But more than knowledge I offer you purpose. You have lived alone with your grief for 15 years, punishing yourself for deaths that were not your fault. Help us save our sacred ground, and you will save more than dead ancestors. You will save the living future of my people, and perhaps find redemption for the ghosts that haunt your sleep. The words hit Garrett harder than any physical blow. In 15 years of isolation, no one had spoken so directly about the guilt that drove him to this lonely existence. Most people who knew his story either offered empty sympathy or avoided the subject entirely. But this Ponca woman saw straight through his defenses to the pain that had shaped every day of his solitary life. You don't know anything about my ghosts, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. I know you built your house facing east, so you can see the sunrise over the hill where 3 graves mark the spot where your family died, Itzel replied calmly. I know you ride out there every Sunday morning and sit for exactly 1 hour before returning home. I know you keep their belongings in a chest under your bed and that you have not spoken their names aloud since the day you buried them. Grief speaks to grief, Garrett Stone. I recognize the weight you carry because I carry my own. The accuracy of her observations left Garrett speechless. He had thought his weekly visits to Margaret and the boys' graves were private, unobserved rituals of remembrance and self-punishment. The fact that this woman had noticed, had understood their significance, made him feel exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since the early days of his grief. Outside, the sound of approaching horses broke through the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Garrett was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun as he peered through the window. 4 riders approached his ranch, their horses moving at a deliberate pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Even at a distance, Garrett could see they wore the distinctive black hats and red bandanas that marked them as Langford's men. They found us, Itzel whispered, her face going pale as she recognized the riders. Somehow they tracked us here, Garrett's mind raced through the possibilities. His ranch was isolated enough that visitors were rare, and Langford's men arriving so soon after Itzel and her children suggested either remarkable luck or inside information. Either way, the situation had just become exponentially more dangerous for everyone involved. "Take the children to the root cellar," Garrett commanded, his voice taking on the authority of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions. "There's a hidden door behind the barrel of flour. Don't make a sound no matter what you hear upstairs. If something happens to me, wait until dark and then ride hard for the Territorial Marshal's office in North Platte." Itzel gathered her children with the swift efficiency of someone who had practiced emergency evacuations before. As they disappeared into the cellar, Garrett checked his weapons and positioned himself near the window where he could observe the approaching riders. Without being easily seen, the 4 men had stopped just outside his fence, their leader a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes, studying the ranch with the calculating gaze of a predator. When the man finally spoke, his voice carried across the distance with practiced authority. "Stone, we know you're in there. We also know you're harboring Indian fugitives. Send them out, and there won't be any trouble." Garrett stepped onto his porch, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Don't know what you're talking about, friend. Haven't seen any Indians around here lately. You boys lost?" The leader spurred his horse closer to the fence, his eyes never leaving Garrett's face. "Name's Jake Morrison, and I work for Preston Langford. We're tracking a Ponca woman and 4 children who stole something valuable from a trading post before. They burned it down. Trail leads right to your door." "Trail's probably old," Garrett replied calmly. "Indians pass through here sometimes, but I don't make it my business to stop and chat with them. Like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description." Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "Funny thing about that, Stone. See, we know these particular Indians killed a white family before they ran. That makes them murderers. Anyone helping murderers would be considered an accessory. Territorial law's pretty clear about what happens to accessories to murder." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunpowder explosion. Garrett had lived on the frontier long enough to know that Langford's men operated outside the law, with virtual impunity, protected by their boss's wealth and political connections. If they decided he was harboring fugitives, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him and claim self-defense. But as he stood on his porch facing down 4 armed men, Garrett felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, a sense of purpose. Beyond mere survival. Below his feet, a Ponca widow and her 4 children waited in darkness, trusting him to protect them from the same kind of violence that had destroyed his own family. For the first time since Margaret and the boys died, Garrett Stone had found something worth fighting for. "Well now, Morrison," Garrett called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had faced death before and found it wanting. "That's quite an accusation you're making. You got any proof these folks you're hunting actually killed anyone, or are you just repeating stories?" Jake Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun, but he didn't draw. Something in Garrett's stance warned him that the scarred rancher wasn't the easy target he appeared to be. The 3 men behind Morrison spread out slightly, their horses prancing nervously as they sensed the tension building between their riders. "Don't need proof when we got orders," Morrison replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Mr. Langford says these Indians are dangerous, and that's good enough for the territorial authorities. Now you can make this easy on yourself, Stone. Just step aside and let us search your property. If you're telling the truth about not seeing anyone, you got nothing to worry about." Garrett's laugh was dry as desert wind. "Search warrant, Morrison? Or are you boys planning to violate a man's property rights based on nothing but Preston Langford's word? Because last I checked, even out here in the territories, a man's home is still his castle." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, each man measuring the others, calculating odds and consequences. Garrett could feel sweat beading. on his forehead despite the cool morning air, but his hand remained steady near his Colt. 15 years of isolation had not dulled his skills with a gun, and Morrison seemed to sense this as his eyes narrowed with grudging respect. "You're making a mistake, Stone," Morrison said finally. "Langford's got influence all the way to the territorial capital. Cross him, and you'll find yourself dealing with more than just the four of us. He's got judges, marshals, and politicians in his pocket. You're just one man with a played-out ranch and a reputation for being unfriendly to visitors." "Maybe so," Garrett agreed, his voice steady. "But I'm one man standing on his own land, and that still means something out here. You want to search my property, you bring me proper papers signed by a real judge, not some bought and paid for lackey of Langford's. Until then, I suggest you boys ride on before you find yourselves in violation of trespassing laws." Morrison's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, one of his men leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear. The man had been studying the ground around Garrett's fence, and whatever he had discovered seemed to give Morrison pause. After a moment of heated whispering, Morrison straightened in his saddle and fixed Garrett with a cold stare. "This isn't over, Stone. We'll be back, and next time we'll have all the legal authority we need. In the meantime, you might want to think real careful about the choices you're making. Langford's memory is long, and his reach is longer. Men who cross him have a way of meeting with unfortunate accidents, with that threat hanging in the air like gun smoke." Morrison wheeled his horse around and led his men away from the ranch. Garrett remained on his porch until they disappeared over the ridge, his hand never leaving his gun until he was certain they were truly gone. Only then did he allow himself to release the breath he had been holding and call down to the root. "Seller, it's safe to come up now," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the floorboards. "They're gone, but they'll be back soon enough." The hidden door behind the flour barrel creaked open, and Itzel emerged first, her dark eyes scanning Garrett's face for signs of deception or danger. Behind her came the children, their faces pale with fear but their movements quick and silent. Little Ayana still looked feverish, but the broth and medicine seemed to have helped stabilize her condition. "You could have given us to them," Itzel said simply, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and puzzlement. "Why did you choose to protect strangers who bring nothing but danger to your door?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the ridge where Morrison's men had disappeared. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, weighted with memories he rarely allowed himself to examine. 15 years ago, I was away on Coast Guard duty when Apache raiders hit the settlement where my wife and boys were staying. When I got back, I found my neighbor, an old German farmer named Klaus Weber, had tried to protect them. The raiders had tortured him for information about where the women and children were hiding. Klaus could have told them everything to save himself, but he died silent. Sometimes a man has to take a stand, regardless of the consequences. Otate, the 12-year-old, stepped forward with the serious demeanor of someone forced to grow up too quickly. "My father died the same way," he said quietly. "Blue coat. Soldiers came to our village demanding information about Sioux war parties. Father told them nothing, even when they hurt him. He said some things are worth dying for." The parallel between their stories hung in the air, creating an unexpected bond between the scarred white rancher and the Ponca boy who had lost his father to violence. Garrett found himself seeing something of his own sons in Otate's protective stance toward his younger siblings. "Morrison mentioned they found tracks," Garrett said, turning his attention back to more immediate concerns. "How did they trail you here so quickly?" Itzel's expression darkened. "There's a traitor among my people, someone who knows our old hiding places and escape routes. 3 times now, Langford's men have found us when they should not have been able to. Each time we barely escaped with our lives." Katori, the 10-year-old daughter, spoke up for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Uncle Howling Wolf has been asking many questions about the burial ground. Mother told him she did not know its exact location, But I saw him watching when Grandfather Winter Bear drew the map in the dirt before he died. Howling Wolf is my brother-in-law, Itzel explained, her voice heavy with betrayal and disappointment. When my husband died, Howling Wolf expected to become the leader of our band. Instead, the elders chose me to guard the secret of the burial ground because they trusted my judgment over his ambition. He has never forgiven this slight. Garrett absorbed this information while checking his weapons and ammunition supplies. If Langford had an informant among the Ponca, it meant that every move Itzel made was potentially being reported to their enemies. The ranch that had seemed like a temporary sanctuary was now more like a trap waiting to be sprung. How many men does Langford have working for him? Garrett asked, his military mind already calculating odds and tactical possibilities. At least 30 hired guns, maybe more, Itzel replied. Plus he has agreements with some of the local ranchers who owe him money. They provide men and supplies in exchange for debt forgiveness. Langford also has contracts with the territorial government to provide security for mining operations, which gives his violence an official appearance. The scope of what they were facing began to sink in. 30 professional gunmen, backed by local ranchers and territorial authority, against one isolated rancher and a Ponca woman with 4 children. The odds were so overwhelmingly against them that any rational person would surrender or flee immediately. But Garrett Stone had not been thinking rationally since the moment he caught little Ayanna as she fell from the horse. Something about this family had awakened feelings he had buried with his wife and sons, and the prospect of watching them be destroyed by Langford's greed stirred a protective fury he hadn't felt in 15 years. The burial ground, he said finally. Where exactly is it located? Itzel hesitated, her loyalty to her ancestors' secrets warring with her desperate need for help. After a long moment, she reached into her leather pouch and withdrew a piece of doeskin covered with intricate markings. Unfolding it carefully, she revealed a hand-drawn map showing the location of the sacred site. It lies in a hidden valley 3 days' ride north of here, past the red rock formations that mark the border of our traditional territory. The entrance is concealed behind a waterfall that falls only during the spring snowmelt. My great-grandfather chose this place specifically because it would be difficult for outsiders to find. Garrett studied the map carefully, noting the landmarks and distances marked in Ponca symbols. His years of military service had taught him to read terrain and plan movements, and he could see immediately why the burial ground would be attractive. To miners, the valley was isolated enough to avoid interference, but accessible enough to transport heavy equipment and large amounts of ore. How did Langford learn about it? He asked. Thomas Whitehorse, my cousin who ran the trading post, was tricked into revealing information, Itzel explained, her voice heavy with grief and anger. Langford's men told him they were territorial surveyors mapping mineral rights for legitimate mining companies. Thomas thought he was helping to protect our interests by explaining which areas were sacred and should be left alone. Instead, he was giving them the exact information they needed to locate the richest deposits. Faye, the 8-year-old who had been silent throughout the morning's excitement, suddenly tugged at his mother's dress and pointed toward the window. His young eyes had spotted something the adults had missed, a glint of reflected sunlight from the ridge, where Morrison's men had disappeared. Someone was watching the ranch through a spyglass. They never left, Garrett said grimly, grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace. Morrison's got at least one man posted on the ridge, probably watching to see if anyone comes or goes. We're trapped here until nightfall. The realization that they were under surveillance changed everything. Any attempt to leave the ranch during daylight would be observed and reported, bringing Langford's full force down on them before they could reach safety. But staying put indefinitely wasn't an option either, especially with little Ayanna still running a fever and in need of proper medical attention. There is another way, Itzel said quietly, studying Garrett's face to gauge his reaction. But It requires trust between us, and the willingness to risk everything on a desperate gamble. What kind of gamble? Itzel refolded the map carefully and returned it to her pouch. We stop running and start fighting. Instead of trying to protect the burial ground by hiding from Langford, we force him to come to us on ground of our choosing. But to do this, you must be willing to leave your ranch and ride with us into Ponca territory, where you will be the outsider and must trust our knowledge of the land. The proposal caught Garrett off guard. For 15 years this ranch had been both his prison and his sanctuary, the place where he had built walls against the world and nursed his grief in solitude. The idea of abandoning it, even temporarily, felt like another death, a final severing of his connection to the life he had known before tragedy reshaped him. But as he looked at the 4 children huddled around their mother, he saw echoes of his own family's last desperate moments. Margaret had died trying to protect Samuel and Daniel, just as Itzel was now fighting to protect her children and her people's sacred legacy. The parallel was too strong to ignore, the chance for redemption too precious to waste. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Langford believes he can take the burial ground by force, because he thinks we are helpless refugees with nowhere to turn. Itzel explained, her voice taking on the strategic tone of a war chief planning battle. But my people still have allies. Among the other tribes, warriors who remember the old ways and honor the ancient treaties between our peoples. If we can reach them and unite them against this common threat, we can turn Langford's strength against him. Otakde stepped forward, his young voice carrying the authority of someone who had inherited his father's warrior spirit. The Omaha Chief Standing Bear owes our family a blood debt for saving his son during the smallpox winter. The Winnebago leader Little Priest has been looking for a chance to strike back against white miners who poisoned his tribe's water supply. If Mother calls in these debts, we could have 50 warriors ready to fight within a week. The plan was audacious in its scope and desperate in its timing. Garrett could see a dozen ways it might fail, from betrayal by tribal allies to intervention by federal troops. But he could also see the brilliant tactical logic behind it, using Langford's own aggressive timeline against him by forcing a confrontation before he could consolidate his position. Even if we could gather that many warriors, Garrett said. Slowly, Langford's got territorial authority on his side. Attack his mining operation, and you'll have the whole U.S. Army coming down on your heads. Not if we can prove he obtained his mining rights through fraud and murder, Itzel replied, her eyes bright with strategic possibility. Thomas Whitehorse kept detailed records of his conversations with Langford's men, including their admissions about bribing territorial officials. Those records are hidden in a cache near the burial ground. If we can retrieve them and get them to an honest federal judge, Langford's legal protections will disappear. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning session. This time, however, the riders were coming from the east rather than the south, and their pace suggested urgency rather than menace. Through the window, Garrett could see 2 figures on horseback, one of whom appeared to be an elderly Indian man riding with the careful dignity of advanced years. Grandfather Winter Bear, Katori whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and concern. But he should not be here. The journey from the reservation is too dangerous for someone his age. Itzel's face went pale as she recognized the approaching riders. Winter Bear was her late husband's grandfather, a keeper of tribal traditions who had been entrusted with many of the Ponca's most sacred secrets. His presence here could only mean that the situation had become even more desperate than she had realized. Garrett watched the old man dismount with the slow, careful movements of someone whose spirit was strong but whose body had been worn down by 8 decades of hard living. His companion was a younger Ponca warrior, whose scarred face and missing left hand marked him as a veteran of the Indian Wars. Both men approached the ranch house with the alertness of people accustomed to traveling through hostile territory. Grandfather, Itzel called softly in Ponca as she stepped onto the porch. You should not have come. The journey is too dangerous, and Langford's men are watching the area. Winter Bear's reply came in rapid Ponca, his aged voice carrying an urgency that needed no translation. As he spoke, Itzel's expression grew increasingly grave, and her children pressed closer to her side, as if sensing the weight of whatever news their great-grandfather had brought. "What is it?" Garrett asked, noting the change in the family's demeanor. "Langford's timeline has changed," Itzel translated, her voice heavy with new desperation. "He is not waiting 3 days to begin mining operations. His advance team reached the burial ground this morning and began setting up equipment. Grandfather Winter Bear and his companion Running Fox barely escaped when Langford's men started shooting at anyone who approached the sacred site. The news hit like a physical blow. Their careful planning had been based on having several days to organize resistance and gather allies. If Langford was already at the burial ground with mining equipment, they had hours rather than days to act before the desecration began in earnest. "How many men does he have at the site?" Garrett asked, his military training taking over as he began calculating tactical options. Running Fox spoke for the first time, his English heavily accented but clear. 20 men with rifles, big machine for digging, wagons full of tools and supplies. They work through the night by torchlight, like demons who fear the sun. Winter Bear added something in Ponca, gesturing toward the hidden valley where the burial ground lay. Itzel nodded grimly and turned to Garrett with a look that mixed determination with desperate hope. "Grandfather says the spirits of our ancestors are angry. The earth itself rebels against Langford's machines. 3 of his workers have been injured by equipment failures, and strange lights have been seen dancing over the graves at night. But spiritual protection can only do so much against bullets and dynamite." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of distant explosions echoed across the prairie from the north. The reverberations were faint but unmistakable dynamite blasts that could only mean one thing. Langford's miners had begun using explosives to break through the rocky ground that protected the Ponca burial sites. Little Ayana stirred in, her mother's arms, her fever-bright eyes opening as the sound of the explosions penetrated her illness-induced stupor. She spoke a few words in Ponca, her child's voice carrying a clarity that seemed to cut through all the adults' strategic planning and political maneuvering. "What did she say?" Garrett asked, Itzel's eyes filled with tears as she translated her youngest daughter's words. She said, "The grandfathers are crying. Can you hear them crying?" She has always been sensitive to the spirit world, even when she was too young to understand what she was sensing. The sound of more explosions rolled across the prairie, each blast feeling like a personal violation to the Ponca family gathered in Garrett's modest ranch house. Winter Bear began singing softly under his breath, a traditional death song for the desecrated ancestors whose rest was being violently disturbed. Garrett found himself facing the most important decision of his life since the day he had chosen to isolate himself after his family's death. He could continue to offer shelter and sympathy while remaining safely neutral, or he could throw himself fully into a desperate fight against overwhelming odds, a fight that would almost certainly end in his death but might save something precious from destruction. The choice, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. 15 years of guilt and isolation had not changed the fundamental truth of who Garrett Stone was, a man who stood up for what was right, regardless of the cost. Margaret and the boys would have expected nothing less from him. "Running Fox," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command. "How long would it take you to reach the allied tribes that Itzel mentioned?" The scarred warrior considered the question carefully. 2 days hard riding to reach Standing Bear, 1 more day to gather Omaha warriors. Winnebago are closer, maybe half day from Omaha territory. "Too long," Garrett said flatly. "Langford will have stripped the burial ground bare by then. We need a different approach." He walked to a chest in the corner of his house and withdrew, something that made all the Ponca adults step back in surprise. It was a cavalry saber, its blade still bright despite its age, with intricate engravings along the fuller that marked it as an officer's weapon. Beside it lay a Union Army colonel's uniform, carefully preserved despite the years. "I wasn't just Coast Guard," Garrett said quietly, noting their surprised expressions. "Before the war, I was cavalry. During the war, I commanded a regiment. After the war ended, I went to the Coast Guard because I was tired of fighting. But some fights choose you whether you're tired of them or not." He began strapping on the saber, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing back memories of battles fought and won through audacity rather than superior numbers. The plan forming in his mind was dangerous beyond reason, but it had the advantage of being so unexpected that it might actually work. "Langford's got 20 men at the burial ground," Garrett continued, his voice taking on the calm certainty of a man who had made his peace with death. "But he's also got his main force of hired guns scattered across 3 counties, hunting for you. If we can make him think you're somewhere else entirely, we might be able to even the odds long enough to accomplish something useful." The explosions from the north continued, each blast a countdown to irreversible tragedy. But for the first time since this desperate morning had begun, Garrett Stone felt something besides resignation and grief. He felt the familiar stirring of a warrior's spirit awakening from 15 years of sleep. 2 hours before dawn, Garrett Stone stood in his barn adjusting the cinch on his black stallion Thunder, the same horse that had carried him through 3 years of cavalry campaigns and countless battles against Confederate forces. The animal sensed the tension in his master's movements, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring as if he too remembered the smell of gunpowder and the thunder of charging hooves. Inside the ranch house, Itzel worked by candlelight, carefully applying war paint to her children's faces using pigments she had carried in her medicine pouch since fleeing the reservation. The traditional design served both spiritual and practical purposes, honoring their ancestors while making the children appear older and more fierce to anyone who might glimpse them from a distance. "The plan depends on perfect timing," Garrett said, checking his rifle and pistol for the 3rd time. Running Fox reaches Iron Horse Creek just as the sun clears the eastern ridge. Winter Bear starts the signal fires exactly 1 hour later. "If either of you is late, this whole deception falls apart and we all die for nothing," Winter Bear nodded solemnly, his weathered hand steady as he prepared the special mixture of green wood and buffalo dung that would create the thick, distinctive smoke needed for their ruse. The old man's eyes held the clarity of someone who had lived through too many battles to be frightened by the prospect of one more. "The spirits of our fathers will guide the smoke," Winter Bear said in careful English. "Langford's men will see what we want them to see, a war party gathering at Iron Horse Creek, preparing to attack his mining operation from the south. They will ride hard to intercept this phantom threat, leaving only a skeleton crew to guard the burial ground." Itzel finished painting Otakte's face and stepped back to examine her work. Her eldest son now looked several years older, his features transformed by the traditional warrior's markings that had been passed down through generations of Ponca fighters. The boy stood straighter under his mother's appraising gaze, accepting the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the paint of his ancestors. "Remember," Itzel said softly, speaking to all her children but looking directly at Otakte, "you are not warriors today. You are ghosts, shadows that move without sound and strike without warning. Your job is to free the captured workers and create confusion while the adults deal with the armed guards. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Your father's spirit watches over you, but it cannot stop bullets." Katori stepped forward, her 10-year-old face set with determination that reminded Garrett painfully of his own daughter Lucy. "Mother, what if the workers don't want to be freed? Some white men hate Indians more than they fear their bosses." It was a sobering question that highlighted one of the many ways their desperate plan could fail. Langford's mining crew consisted of desperate men, ex-soldiers, and drifters who might see rescue by Indians as a threat rather than salvation. If the workers chose to fight alongside their captors, the odds would shift dramatically against the rescue party. Then we leave them to their choice, Garrett said grimly. Our job is to stop the desecration and recover Thomas Whitehorse's evidence, not to save people who don't want saving. Sometimes mercy has to take second place to necessity, outside. The sound of horses approaching at a gallop broke through the pre-dawn silence. Garrett immediately grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, but Itzel placed a restraining hand on his arm as she listened to the rhythm of the hoofbeats. 3 horses, 2 riders, she said quietly. One of the horses is carrying double. Wait. Running Fox and Winter Bear would not return unless something had gone terribly wrong. The riders burst into view just as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern hills. Running Fox rode in the lead, his scarred face grim with exhaustion and bad news, while Winter Bear clung to the back of the second horse, supported by a young Ponca woman Garrett didn't recognize. All 3 looked as if they had been riding hard through dangerous territory. The plan is compromised, Running Fox announced without preamble as he dismounted. Howling Wolf reached Langford before we could get into position. The mining camp has been reinforced with additional guards, and they're expecting an attack from Iron Horse Creek. The young woman helping Winter Bear down from the horse spoke rapidly in Ponca, her voice urgent and frightened. Itzel's face went pale as she listened, and when the woman finished speaking, she turned to Garrett with eyes that held the weight of absolute despair. This is Ayanna Crowdog, Thomas Whitehorse's daughter, Itzel explained. She was hiding near the burial ground when Howling Wolf arrived with Langford's men. She heard them planning to use the sacred site as bait for a trap. They know we're coming, and they're ready for us. Garrett felt the familiar cold sensation in his stomach that had always preceded the worst battles of his military career. The careful deception they had planned was now useless, their element of surprise lost before they could even begin their attack. Worse, Langford now knew exactly who his enemies were and what they were capable of. How many additional men did he bring? Garrett asked, his tactical mind already adjusting to the new reality. 15 more gunmen, Ayanna Crowdog replied in heavily accented English, plus wagons full of supplies and ammunition. They have built barricades around the digging site and posted sentries on all the high ground. It would take an army to break through their defenses now. Inepe, who had been quietly listening to the adults' conversation, suddenly tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed toward the northern horizon. His sharp young eyes had spotted something the others had missed. A column of black smoke rising from the direction of the burial ground, thicker and more ominous than the signal fires they had planned to use. They're burning something, Garrett said, grabbing his military field glasses and focusing on the distant smoke. Something big enough to create that much smoke, but controlled enough to stay in one column. Winter Bear's voice was barely a whisper as he spoke the words that chilled everyone present to the bone. The Sacred Lodge. They are burning the ceremonial buildings that have stood for 300 years. The revelation hit the Ponca family like a physical blow. The Sacred Lodge was more than just a building, it was the spiritual heart of their ancestral burial ground, the place where countless generations had come to commune with the spirits of the dead. Its destruction represented a level of desecration that went far beyond mere grave robbing. Itzel sank to her knees, overcome by the magnitude of what was being destroyed while she stood helpless to prevent it. Her children gathered around her, offering what comfort they could, but their own faces showed the same expression of devastated loss. For a moment, the weight of accumulated tragedy seemed too much for any of them to bear, but it was little Liana, still weak from fever but possessing the spiritual insight that sometimes comes to those who hover between life and death, who broke the spell of despair that had settled over the group. She spoke a single sentence in Ponca, her child's voice carrying an authority that made all the adults turn to listen. "What did she say?" Garrett asked. Itzel wiped tears from her eyes and translated with wonder in her voice. "She said, the grandfathers are not in the lodge. They are in the people who remember them. She's right. Langford can burn buildings and dig up bones, but he cannot destroy what lives in our hearts and memories." The child's wisdom provided exactly the spark needed to reignite their determination. Garrett found himself thinking of his own family's graves, and how he had spent 15 years believing that visiting their burial site was the only way to honor their memory. But Margaret and the boys lived on in every act of courage he performed, every moment of compassion he showed to others in need. "The evidence," he said suddenly, his mind racing toward a new possibility. "Thomas Whitehorse's records that prove Langford's fraud, where exactly did he hide them?" Ayanna Crow Dog looked confused by the question. "Uncle Thomas told me they were buried beneath the sacred lodge, wrapped in waterproof skins and sealed in a metal box. But if the lodge is burning, then Langford's men either found the evidence or destroyed it without knowing what they had," Garrett finished. "Either way, our legal case against him just went up in smoke along with everything else." Running. Fox, who had been studying the distant smoke column through his own field glasses, suddenly straightened with excitement. "Wait," he said, handing the glasses to Winter Bear. "Look more carefully at what burns. The smoke is too black, too thick. That is not wood smoke from a lodge fire." Winter Bear peered through the glasses for a long moment, then began speaking. Rapidly in Ponca, his aged voice growing stronger with each word. Itzel listened intently, her expression changing from despair to puzzlement to dawning hope. "Grandfather says they are not burning the sacred lodge," she translated. "The smoke comes from coal and oil, the kind used to fuel steam-powered mining equipment. Something has gone wrong with Langford's operation. The machinery is burning. Not our buildings." The news changed everything once again. If Langford's mining equipment was destroyed, it would set his operation back weeks or even months, giving them time to organize proper resistance and seek legal remedies. But it also raised the question of how such a convenient accident had occurred. "Sabotage," Garrett said with certainty. "Someone got close enough to wreck his machinery and set it on fire. But who? And how did they get past all those guards?" Ayanna Crow Dog smiled for the first time since her arrival, her young face lighting up with mischievous pride. "My little brother Joseph. He has been living wild in the hills since our family was killed, surviving like a wolf pup. The guards watch for war parties and riders, but they do not watch for a 9-year-old boy who can crawl through grass like a snake." The image of a child saboteur operating behind enemy lines was both inspiring and terrifying. Joseph Crow Dog had lost his family to Langford's violence and chosen to fight back using the only weapons available to him: stealth, cunning, and the intimate knowledge of the land that came from growing up in harmony with nature. If the boy damaged their equipment badly enough, Langford will have to send men back to town for replacement parts, Garrett said, his military experience helping him analyze the tactical implications. That means fewer guards at the burial ground, at least temporarily, but it also means they will be hunting Joseph like an animal, Itzel added, her maternal instincts awakened by the thought of a child alone in hostile territory. A 9-year-old cannot survive indefinitely while being pursued by 30 armed men. Winter Bear spoke again in Ponca, his words carrying the weight of tribal authority. When he finished, Running Fox nodded grimly and began checking his weapons with renewed purpose. Grandfather says the time for clever plans and careful strategy has passed, Itzel translated. The spirits demand direct action to rescue the boy and protect what remains of our sacred ground. We attack at noon, when the sun blinds the sentries and the heat makes the guards lazy. It was a desperate plan born of desperation, but Garrett could see the wisdom in Winter Bear's thinking. Their earlier attempts at deception had failed because they were fighting Langford on his terms, using methods he understood and could counter. A direct assault by a small force against superior numbers was so tactically unsound that it might succeed through sheer audacity. "How many warriors can we muster?" Garrett asked. "7, Running Fox replied without hesitation. "Myself, Winter Bear, Otakte when he proves himself ready, and 4 young men who arrived during the night from the reservation. They came seeking glory and the chance to strike back against the miners who poisoned their relatives. 7 warriors against 20 or more armed guards seemed like suicide. But Garrett had seen smaller forces achieve victory through superior knowledge of terrain and absolute commitment to their cause. The key would be using the burial ground's natural defenses to their advantage, while coordinating their attack with Joseph's sabotage efforts. What about the children?" he asked, looking at Itzel's younger ones. "They can't be part of a direct assault." "They come with us," Itzel said firmly. "Katori knows every secret path through the burial ground from childhood visits with her grandmother. Inape can move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf, and Ayana's spiritual sensitivity allows her to sense danger before it appears. My children are not helpless burdens. They are advantages that Langford's men cannot match." Garrett studied the faces around him, an elderly tribal leader, a scarred veteran, a determined mother, and children forced to grow up too quickly by violence and loss. It was hardly the force he would have chosen for a military assault, but it was the force available, and he had learned long ago that wars were won by people who fought with what they had, rather than waiting for what they wanted. "All right," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command. "But we do this properly, with military discipline and tactical coordination. No individual heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get in, rescue the boy, stop the desecration, and get out alive. Anyone who has a problem with following orders should leave now." No one moved. Even the children stood straighter, accepting their roles in what would likely be the most dangerous day of their young lives. Garrett felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the mixture of pride and fear that always preceded battle. The sound of horses approaching from the south interrupted their planning. This time, however, the riders were moving slowly and openly, making no attempt at concealment. Through his field glasses, Garrett could see 4 men in civilian clothes, one of whom carried a white flag of truce. "Langford himself," Running Fox said with disgust. "He comes to gloat over his victory and offer false mercy." But as the riders drew closer, Garrett could see that the man in the lead was not Preston Langford. Instead, it was someone far more dangerous, a United States Marshal with federal authority that superseded any local law enforcement. The badge on his vest caught the morning sunlight like a warning beacon. "Marshal Carson," Garrett said with recognition and growing dread. "I know that man from my army days. He's honest, but inflexible, the kind who follows orders regardless of circumstances. If Langford has convinced him that we're dangerous fugitives, then our war just became a fight against the entire federal government." Itzel finished, her voice heavy with the weight of impossible odds. The marshal's party stopped just outside rifle range and waited, the white flag snapping in the prairie wind. After a moment, Marshal Carson rode forward alone, his hands visible and empty, but his manner radiating the absolute confidence of a man backed by federal authority. "Stone," he called out. "I'm here to talk, not fight. But I've got federal warrants for the arrest of Itzel Singing Wolf and her accomplices on charges of murder and theft. Send them out peaceful-like, and nobody else has to get hurt." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Federal warrants meant that Itzel and her children would be taken to trial in territorial court, where Langford's influence and bought judges would ensure conviction regardless of evidence or truth. It also meant that anyone helping them would be guilty of harboring federal fugitives. But as Garrett looked at the desperate family who had trusted him with their lives, he found his answer in the memory of another federal marshal who had once offered him similar terms. That marshal had wanted him to surrender Apache leaders who had committed no crime except defending their homeland against invasion. Marshal Garrett called back. These people are under my protection. If you want them, you'll have to come through me. The declaration of defiance sealed their fate. There would be no more negotiations, no more attempts at legal solutions. The final confrontation. Between Langford's greed and the Ponca, family's determination would be settled by force of arms in the shadow of desecrated graves. As Marshal Carson rode back to his men, Garrett Stone felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders once again. In a few hours, he would lead 7 warriors and 4 children against impossible odds, fighting not for territory or treasure, but for the simple right to exist with dignity in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything decent and sacred. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the prairie as both sides prepared for the battle that would determine whether justice or greed would triumph in the hidden valley where the Ponca ancestors slept their eternal sleep. The hidden canyon 3 miles east of the burial ground provided perfect concealment for their desperate war council, its red sandstone walls rising like cathedral spires toward the cloudless Nebraska sky. Garrett crouched beside a natural spring, studying the crude map that Running Fox had sketched in the sandy soil using a sharp stick and fragments of charcoal from their cold campfire. The federal marshal changes everything, Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper as he traced the defensive positions Langford's men had established around the sacred site. Carson's not some corrupt territorial judge we can outmaneuver with legal technicalities. He's got legitimate federal warrants, which means killing his men would make us all wanted fugitives with no place to hide in the entire territory. Itzel sat cross-legged beside the spring, braiding eagle feathers into her daughter Katori's hair while the 10-year-old practiced, moving silently through the rocky terrain. The ancient ritual of preparing for battle helped calm both mother and daughter, but Garrett could see the tension in Itzel's shoulders as she contemplated the impossible situation they faced. "There is another way," Winter Bear said suddenly, his weathered voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 8 decades by thinking beyond. CONVENTI, O'Hinnell Solutions. The Ghost Wolf Ceremony. It has not been performed in 30 years, but the old knowledge remains alive in my memory. Running Fox looked up sharply from where he was sharpening his knife on a piece of sandstone. "Grandfather, the Ghost Wolf ceremony requires a willing sacrifice. Someone must enter the spirit world and never return. The cost is too high. All worthy victories require sacrifice," Winter Bear replied calmly. "The question is whether we choose the sacrifice or let our enemies choose it for us. If we attack their fortified position directly, we all die and accomplish nothing. If we surrender to the federal marshal, Itzel and her children die slowly in territorial prison, while Langford destroys everything our ancestors held sacred." Garrett had never heard of the Ghost Wolf ceremony, but the reverent way the Ponca warriors spoke of it suggested both incredible power and terrible risk. His military experience had taught him to be skeptical of supernatural solutions to tactical problems, but 15 years of frontier living had also shown him that some aspects of Indian spiritual practice defied rational explanation. "What exactly does this ceremony involve?" he asked. Winter Bear drew a complex symbol in the sand beside Running Fox's map of Wolf's head surrounded by spiraling lines that seemed to move and shift, even though they were perfectly still. "The Ghost Wolf is the spirit guardian of lost souls, the guide who leads the dead to their final rest. In times of greatest need, a living person can call upon the Ghost Wolf to walk among the enemies of the people, bringing confusion, fear, and madness to those who would desecrate sacred ground." Otakte, who had been quietly listening while cleaning his rifle, suddenly straightened with understanding. The stories grandmother used to tell about warriors who became invisible, who could walk through enemy camps without being seen. Those were about the Ghost Wolf ceremony. "But the price," Itzel said, her voice heavy with maternal concern. "You said someone must never return from the spirit world. What does that mean exactly?" Winter Bear's eyes grew distant as he accessed memories passed down through generations of tribal shamans. The person who performs the ceremony becomes a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They can move unseen among enemies, influence their thoughts and dreams, even appear as animals or shadows. But once the ceremony is complete, they can never fully return to the living world. They become something between human and spirit, forever changed. The implications of what Winter Bear was describing slowly sank in. Someone among their small group would have to volunteer for a transformation that amounted to spiritual death, sacrificing their humanity to gain the power needed to defeat their enemies. It was a price that made physical death seem merciful by comparison. "I'll do it," Garrett said without hesitation, his voice carrying the finality of an irrevocable decision. "I've been dead to the world for 15 years anyway. At least. This way, my death would serve some purpose." "No," Itzel said firmly, her hand moving to rest on his arm. "The ceremony requires someone with deep spiritual connection to the land and the ancestors. A white man, even one with a good heart, cannot serve as a bridge between Ponca spirits and the living world. It must be someone of the blood." The terrible logic of her words was inescapable. Only someone with ancestral ties to the burial ground could successfully perform the ghost wolf ceremony, which meant the sacrifice would have to come from among the Ponca family members present. Garrett watched as the weight of this realization settled over each of them in turn. "I will do it," Running Fox said quietly, his scarred face showing no emotion as he accepted what might be his fate. "I have no wife, no children to mourn. My passing, my wounds from the Indian wars make me less useful in direct combat than I once was. It is logical that I should make this sacrifice." But before anyone could respond to Running Fox's offer, little Ayanna stirred from where she had been resting against her mother's side. The 5-year-old's fever had broken during the night, but her eyes still held the otherworldly clarity that sometimes came to those who had walked close to death. "The grandfathers say no," she said in her clear child's voice, speaking English. For the benefit of Garrett and the others who didn't understand Ponca, Running Fox is needed here, in this world. The ghost wolf calls to someone else. Winter Bear studied the child's face intently, seeing something there that made his expression grow grave with understanding. Ayanna has been touched by the spirit world since her birth. If she says the ancestors have chosen differently, we must listen to their wisdom. The old man began gathering specific items from his medicine bundle, a wolf's fang, sage leaves, and a piece of obsidian that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As he worked, he spoke in a mixture of English and Ponca, explaining the ritual's requirements to everyone present. The ceremony must be performed at sunset, when the veil between worlds grows thin. The chosen one will drink a sacred potion that opens their spiritual sight, then enter a trance that allows their spirit to separate from their body. Once separated, they become invisible to normal human perception and can influence the thoughts of their enemies. Katori, who had been practicing her stealth movements in the shadows of the canyon walls, suddenly froze and pointed toward the northern rim of their hiding place. Her sharp young eyes had spotted movement, a lone figure making his way down the treacherous rock face with the fluid grace of someone born to climb. "Joseph Crow Dog," Running Fox said with relief as he recognized the 9-year-old saboteur. "The boy has found us." Joseph reached the canyon floor and immediately ran to Ayanna Crow Dog, embracing his sister with the desperate intensity of someone who had thought he might never see family again. His clothes were torn and dirty from days of living wild in the hills, but his eyes burned with the fierce intelligence that had allowed him to survive alone in hostile territory. "I destroyed 3 steam engines and 2 drilling machines," he reported proudly, speaking in rapid Ponca mixed with English words learned from his late father. "But they bring more equipment from town, and Langford grows suspicious. He has offered a $100 reward for the Indian ghost who haunts his operation." The boys' success had bought them valuable time, But Garrett could see that Joseph was exhausted from his one-man war against Langford's forces. Dark circles under his eyes and the tremor in his small hands spoke of stress and sleeplessness that no child should have to endure. "How many guards are watching the burial ground now?" Garrett asked. 15 men with rifles, plus the federal marshal and his deputies, Joseph replied. "But they are afraid now. Strange things happen at night. Tools disappear, horses refuse to enter certain areas, and men wake from dreams of angry spirits. Some of Langford's hired guns have already quit and ridden back to town." Winter Bear nodded approvingly at this news. The ancestors grow restless as the desecration continues. Their anger weakens the barriers between worlds, making the Ghost Wolf ceremony more powerful but also more dangerous for the one who performs it. As if summoned by their conversation about spiritual forces, a real wolf appeared on the canyon rim high above them. The animal was larger than any wolf Garrett had ever seen, its coat a mixture of gray and silver that seemed to shift and change in the afternoon sunlight. For a long moment, it stared down at their small group with intelligent yellow eyes. Then, impossible as it seemed, the wolf spoke. Not in words that human ears could hear, but in a voice that resonated directly in their minds, carrying messages that transcended language barriers. The wolf's spirit voice was ancient and patient, like the sound of wind through primeval forests. It spoke of sacrifice and transformation, of the price that must be paid to protect sacred ground from those who would destroy it for profit. But most importantly, it spoke of choice, the terrible freedom that came with accepting responsibility for others' survival. When the vision ended and the wolf vanished like morning mist, Winter Bear was the first to break the profound silence that had settled over their group. "The Ghost Wolf has chosen," he said simply. "The ceremony will be performed tonight, and the ancestors will guide our actions." But the old shaman's next words sent a chill through everyone present. "However, the spirits demand that the chosen one make their decision freely, without pressure from others. We cannot know who has been selected until sunset, when the ritual begins and the Ghost Wolf reveals its will." The uncertainty of not knowing who would make the ultimate sacrifice added a new layer of tension to their already desperate situation. Each member of their small war party now faced the possibility that they might be called upon to surrender their humanity for the greater good. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, they made their final preparations for what would either be their greatest victory or their complete destruction. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, prayers were offered to various gods and spirits, and final messages were shared in case some members of the group didn't survive to see another dawn. Garrett found himself thinking about Margaret and the boys, wondering if they would approve of his decision to risk everything for a family he had known for less than a week. But as he watched Itzel braiding protective charms into her children's hair, he knew that his wife would have expected nothing less from him. The sound of distant gunfire echoed across the prairie from the direction of the burial ground, followed by shouting voices and the thunder of galloping horses. Someone was under attack, but whether it was Langford's men fighting off raiders or federal marshals pursuing fugitives was impossible to determine from their concealed position. "Whatever's happening over there, it's big enough to draw attention." "Away from the burial ground," Garrett observed, studying the dust clouds visible on the horizon. "This might be our chance to get closer without being detected." Running Fox had climbed partway up the canyon wall to get a better view of the distant action. When he returned, his expression was grim with new complications. 3 separate groups of riders converging on the burial ground from different directions. "Looks like Langford called in reinforcements from the territorial militia." The presence of territorial militia meant that their small war party was now facing organized military opposition in addition to federal marshals and hired gunmen. The odds against them had shifted from impossible to completely hopeless. But as the sun began its final descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Winter Bear began the preliminary rituals. of the Ghost Wolf ceremony. The ancient words he spoke seemed to resonate with the stone itself, creating harmonies that human throats should not have been able to produce. Garrett felt a strange tingling sensation in his chest, as if something deep inside him was responding to the shaman's chanting. Around the circle, he could see similar reactions in the faces of his companions, a mixture of fear and anticipation. As they waited to learn which of them would be chosen for transformation, the ceremony was about to begin, and with it, their last desperate gamble against forces that seemed determined to destroy everything they held sacred. In the gathering twilight of the hidden canyon, surrounded by the spirits of ancient warriors, Garrett Stone prepared to discover whether courage and sacrifice could triumph over greed and corruption. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above them, the Ghost Wolf's ethereal howl echoed across the prairie, calling the chosen one to step forward and accept their destiny. The sacred potion tasted like bitter earth mixed with copper pennies and ancient smoke, burning Garrett's throat as he swallowed the last drop from Winter Bear's ceremonial bowl. Around the small fire that flickered in the heart of the hidden canyon, the faces of his companions wavered and shifted as the mystical brew began its work on his consciousness. "I don't understand," Itzel whispered, her voice seeming to come from very far away despite her close proximity. "The Ghost Wolf was supposed to choose one of us, someone with tribal blood. How can a white man perform the ceremony that connects our ancestors to the living world?" Winter Bear's ancient eyes reflected the dancing flames as he began packing away his medicine bundle with slow, deliberate movements. The spirits see beyond the color of skin to the color of souls. Garrett Stone carries the blood of warriors who died protecting their families, just as our warriors do. Grief and honor speak the same language in every tribe, the old shamans. Words seemed to echo inside Garrett's skull as the potion's effects intensified. Colors became more vivid while sounds grew muffled and distant, as if he were sinking beneath the surface of a vast, warm lake. His consciousness began to separate from his physical body, creating a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. Through eyes that no longer seemed entirely his own, Garrett watched Itzel gather her children close around the dying fire. Katori held little Iana on her lap, while Otakte and Anape flanked their mother like young sentinels, their faces painted with traditional designs that seemed to glow with their own inner light in the gathering darkness. "The transformation has begun," Running Fox observed, his scarred features showing a mixture of respect and concern as he studied Garrett's increasingly distant expression. "But performing the Ghost Wolf ceremony without proper tribal initiation is dangerous beyond measure. The spirits may accept him as their vessel, or they may destroy his mind completely." Garrett tried to respond, but found that his voice had become something strange and otherworldly, carrying harmonics that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. When he spoke, it was as if multiple voices were emerging from his throat simultaneously, his own familiar tone mixed with others he didn't recognize. "The ancestors speak through me now," he said, though he wasn't entirely certain he was the one choosing the words. "They tell me that Langford's men are afraid, that their courage wavers as darkness falls over the burial ground. The time has come to strike at their hearts and minds rather than their bodies." Joseph Crow Dog, who had been keeping watch from a concealed position near the canyon mouth, suddenly scrambled down the rock face with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Soldiers coming," he announced breathlessly. "Real army soldiers, not just territorial militia. Maybe 50 men with cavalry sabers and repeating rifles." The arrival of federal troops changed the tactical situation completely. Unlike hired gunmen or local militia, regular army soldiers were trained professionals who would not be easily intimidated or confused. Worse, their presence meant that the conflict had escalated beyond a local dispute to something that threatened to become a full-scale Indian war. Langford must have convinced the territorial governor that we're planning a major uprising, Itzel said, her strategic mind quickly grasping the implications. "If army troops engage us in battle, other tribes will be forced to choose sides. This could spread across 3 territories, but Garrett was no longer fully present to hear her analysis. The Ghost Wolf potion had completed its work, separating his spirit from his physical form and opening doorways in his consciousness that revealed landscapes of dreams and nightmares. He could see the burial ground as clearly as if he were standing there, despite being miles away. The sacred site appeared before him like a vision painted in silver light and shadow. Langford's men huddled around their campfires, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear as strange sounds echoed through the darkness around them. Steam-powered drilling equipment sat silent and cold. Their operators, too frightened to work after sunset, fell over the desecrated ground. Marshal Carson paced nervously among the federal deputies, his usual confidence shaken by reports of supernatural activity that his rational mind refused to accept. Even the army captain who had arrived with reinforcements seemed unsettled by the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the burial ground like a burial shroud. Through his transformed perception, Garrett could sense the emotional state of every person in Langford's camp. Fear dominated their thoughts, fear of Indian attacks, fear of the dark, and most powerfully, fear of the angry spirits that seemed to whisper threats from every shadow. This terror was their weakness, the crack in their armor that the Ghost Wolf could exploit. "I can see them all," Garrett whispered, his voice now completely unlike his normal tone. 63 men total, but their hearts are divided. The soldiers follow orders, but question their mission. The hired guns want to flee, but are trapped by contracts and pride. Even Langford himself begins to doubt whether any amount of gold is worth the price he's paying. Winter Bear nodded approvingly as he observed the changes taking place in Garrett's appearance. The rancher's features had become sharper and more angular, while his eyes now held flecks of yellow that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. Most dramatically, his shadow on the canyon wall had taken on the unmistakable silhouette of a wolf. "The transformation is nearly complete," the old shaman announced. "Soon he will be able to walk among our enemies as invisible as smoke, planting seeds of doubt and terror that will grow into panic and retreat. But the window of opportunity is narrow. The Ghost Wolf's power reaches its peak at midnight and fades with the dawn." Itzel reached out to touch Garrett's hand, gasping as her fingers made contact with skin that felt cold as winter stream water. "Can you still hear us? Do you remember who you are and why you're fighting?" Garrett's transformed gaze focused on her with effort, as if he were looking across vast distances to see her face. "I remember everything," he said, though his voice carried echoes of wolves howling across endless prairies. "Margaret and the boys, your family's courage, the sacred ground that must be protected. The Ghost Wolf feeds on these memories, using them as fuel for the magic that will save us all." As midnight approached, Garrett's physical body began to fade, becoming translucent as his spirit prepared to leave the canyon and journey to the burial ground. The process was both beautiful and terrifying to witness, a man voluntarily dissolving the bonds that tied his soul to the material world. "Remember," Winter Bear called out as Garrett's form grew increasingly ethereal, "you must return before sunrise, or the transformation becomes permanent. The Ghost Wolf can guide lost souls to their rest, but it cannot find its own way back to the living world without help from those who love it." The warning came just as Garrett's spirit finally separated completely from his body, leaving behind only a hollow shell that breathed, but showed no other signs of life. His transformed consciousness soared through the night sky like a raptor riding thermal currents, covering the distance to the burial ground in moments that felt like hours. When he materialized among Langford's forces, Garrett discovered that his new form could shift between visibility and complete transparency at will. The guards posted around the perimeter of the camp looked right through him as he passed, their eyes unable to focus on something that existed partially in the spirit world. His first target was a young soldier who stood watch over the drilling equipment, clutching his rifle with white-knuckled hands as he tried to ignore the strange sounds that seemed to come from the desecrated graves themselves. Garrett approached unseen and began whispering directly into the man's mind. "You're digging up children," the ghost wolf's voice echoed inside the soldier's consciousness. "Little ones who died of smallpox and scarlet fever, who were buried with toys and treasures to comfort them in the next world. Every shovel of dirt you move disturbs their eternal sleep." The soldier's face went pale as images flashed through his mind, visions of small skeletons clutching wooden dolls, of burial goods scattered by mechanical diggers, of tiny skulls crushed beneath the weight of mining equipment. Within minutes, he was vomiting uncontrollably, his rifle forgotten as he stumbled away from his post. Moving like a wraith through the camp, Garrett repeated this psychological assault on guard after guard, planting specific fears tailored to each man's particular weaknesses. To the Irish immigrant who operated the steam drill, he showed visions of his own mother's grave being desecrated by foreign invaders. To the Confederate veteran who served as Langford's lieutenant, he whispered about the unmarked graves of Southern soldiers being plowed under for railroad construction. The cumulative effect was devastating. Within an hour, half of Langford's force was incapacitated by supernatural terror, while the other half demanded immediate withdrawal to town. Even Marshal Carson found himself questioning the wisdom of his mission, as ghostly voices seemed to call his name from the darkness. But it was Langford himself who proved the most challenging target. The land speculator's greed had hardened his heart against most forms of guilt or fear, making him resistant to the ghost wolf's psychological influence. When Garrett attempted to enter his mind, he encountered barriers of pure avarice that seemed to repel spiritual intrusion. "You're not real," Langford snarled into the darkness, apparently sensing some presence even though he couldn't see Garrett's transformed form. "Just Indian superstition and tricks of light. I've seen enough frontier fakery to know the difference between magic and stagecraft." Realizing that conventional fear tactics wouldn't work on such a hardened soul, Garrett shifted his approach. Instead of trying to terrify Langford, he began showing him visions of the future, specifically the legal and financial consequences of his actions. Images flashed through the land speculator's mind of congressional investigations, federal prosecutors, and bankruptcy courts. Thomas Whitehorse documented everything. The ghost wolf whispered directly into Langford's consciousness. Every bribe, every forged document, every murdered witness. The evidence is hidden where your hired guns will never find it, but federal investigators will uncover it all. Your empire is built on sand, and the tide is coming in. For the first time since beginning his campaign of terror, Garrett saw genuine fear flicker across his target's face. Langford's greed might make him immune to supernatural dread, but the prospect of losing everything to legal prosecution struck at the core of his being. The psychological assault continued throughout the night, with Garrett moving invisibly through Langford's camp like a plague of doubt and despair. By the time the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn, more than 3/4 of the enemy force had either fled or become too demoralized to fight effectively. But as the sun climbed higher, Garrett felt his connection to the spirit world beginning to weaken. The ghost wolf's power was tied to darkness and mystery, both of which faded with the coming of daylight. Soon, he would need to choose between returning to his physical body or remaining forever in the realm of spirits and dreams. The decision became urgent as he sensed Itzel's voice calling to him across the miles that separated the burial ground from their hidden canyon. She was singing an ancient Ponca song about warriors returning home from battle, her voice serving as a beacon to guide his transformed soul back to the world of the living. With tremendous effort, Garrett began the dangerous journey back to his body, fighting against the ghost wolf's desire to remain in the spirit realm where pain and loss held no power. The transformation that had seemed so natural in darkness now felt like tearing apart his very essence. Each mile covered leaving him weaker and more fragmented, but Itzel's voice grew stronger as he approached the canyon, joined now by the Waimu voices of her children and the other warriors who waited for his return. Their combined call created a lifeline that he could follow back to physical existence, though the cost of the journey would leave him forever changed. As the sun crested the eastern horizon, Garrett's spirit finally reunited with his waiting body, the impact of reintegration so violent that he collapsed unconscious beside the cold ashes of their ceremonial fire. The Ghost Wolf ceremony was complete, and their enemies lay in disarray, but the true test of their victory was yet to come. 3 days after the Ghost Wolf ceremony, Garrett Stone stood before the largest gathering of tribal leaders, federal officials, and territorial representatives ever assembled in Nebraska territory. The meeting took place in the Great Lodge of Chief Standing Bear, whose Omaha village had become neutral ground for negotiations that would determine the fate of sacred burial sites across the entire frontier. The transformation Garrett had undergone during his spirit journey was still visible in subtle ways that made both Indians and whites uneasy in his presence. His eyes held flecks of yellow that seemed to glow in certain light, and his shadow appeared unnaturally dark and wolf-like even in broad daylight. More unsettling still was his ability to sense the emotional states of everyone around him, a spiritual sensitivity that had not faded with the dawn. The evidence recovered from Thomas Whitehorse's cache proves beyond any doubt that Preston Langford obtained his mining rights through systematic fraud, bribery, and murder, announced Judge Harrison Caldwell, the federal circuit judge who had traveled from Omaha City to oversee the emergency hearings. Every document in his possession has been proven false. Every territorial official he claimed to have authorization from has denied any knowledge of his activities. Seated in the place of honor beside Chief Standing Bear, Itzel Singing Wolf wore the traditional dress of a Ponca peace negotiator, her face painted with symbols that declared her authority to speak for her people's ancestral claims. The respect shown to her by tribal leaders from 6 different nations demonstrated how completely the political landscape had shifted in the aftermath of Langford's spectacular defeat. "My people do not seek to drive all whites from our traditional territories," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded lodge as she addressed the mixed assembly. "We understand that the world has changed, that settlers and miners and railroad builders will continue to come. But there must be boundaries that even desperate men will not cross, places so sacred that they remain untouched by the hunger for gold and land." Marshall Carson, who had spent 2 sleepless nights trying to understand how his supposedly simple arrest mission had turned into a rout that left half his prisoners babbling about ghosts and demons, shifted uncomfortably as he prepared to make his report to the federal authorities. The lawman's rigid worldview had been badly shaken by events he could neither explain nor dismiss. "In my 20 years of federal service," Carson said slowly, "I have never encountered circumstances like those at the Ponca burial ground. Men who had served with distinction in multiple military campaigns became completely incapacitated by what they described as supernatural terror. Equipment that had been sabotaged repaired itself overnight. And the main suspect in this case, Preston Langford, was found in a catatonic state, mumbling about gold turning to dust in his hands." The official proceedings were interrupted by a commotion outside. The lodge's late arrivals made their way through the crowd of observers who had gathered to witness this historic meeting. Through the entrance flap came a figure that made everyone in the assembly turn to stare. Howling Wolf, the Ponca traitor whose betrayal had nearly doomed Itzel's family. But the man who entered bore little resemblance to the proud warrior who had sold his people's secrets for Langford's gold. Howling Wolf's hair had turned completely white, his face was gaunt with what appeared to be weeks of sleeplessness, and his hands trembled as he approached the center of the lodge where the negotiations were taking place. "I have come to confess my crimes before the spirits of my ancestors and the representatives of both peoples," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 nights ago, I was visited by the Ghost Wolf in my dreams. It showed me the consequences of my betrayal, not just for my own family, but for all Indian people who will face similar choices in the years to come. Winter Bear, who had been serving as spiritual advisor to the Ponca delegation, rose from his place beside the ceremonial fire and approached his former tribesmen with the dignity of someone who had seen enough tragedy to understand the difference between evil and weakness. "Speak your confession freely, nephew," the old shaman said gently. "The spirits judge our actions, but they also offer redemption to those with the courage to seek it." Howling Wolf's confession revealed the full scope of Langford's corruption network, implicating territorial officials, local ranchers, and even some federal employees in a conspiracy that had been systematically stealing Indian land through fraud and violence. More importantly, his testimony provided the legal foundation needed to invalidate hundreds of questionable mining claims across 3 territories. But it was the spiritual dimension of his confession that had the most profound impact on everyone present. Howling Wolf described in vivid detail the visions that had tormented him since the Ghost Wolf ceremony, scenes of his own children and grandchildren, living as refugees in a world where no ground was considered too sacred to be destroyed for profit. "I thought I was protecting my family by choosing the winning side," he said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "But the Ghost Wolf showed me that there can be no winners when the sacred places of the earth are destroyed. Gold runs out, cattle die, railroad tracks rust away, but the spirits of the ancestors are eternal." Garrett felt a strange stirring in his chest as he listened to Howling Wolf's words, recognizing in them the same guilt and self-recrimination that had driven his own 15 years of isolation. The Ghost Wolf's influence allowed him to sense the genuine nature of the man's repentance, the sincere desire to make amends for choices that could never be completely undone. "The question before us now," Judge Caldwell continued, "is not whether crimes were committed. That has been established beyond doubt. The question is how to prevent similar tragedies in the future, while respecting the legitimate needs of both settler and tribal communities." Chief Standing Bear rose to address the assembly, his presence commanding immediate attention from Indians and whites alike. As one of the most respected leaders in the territory, his words would carry enormous weight in determining the outcome of these negotiations. "For too long, our peoples have seen each other as enemies fighting over the same land," he said, his English careful and precise despite the strong accent that marked him as a native Ponca speaker. "But this crisis has shown us another way forward, a path where the knowledge of one people can benefit the other, where boundaries are respected and treaties have meaning." The chief gestured toward Garrett, acknowledging his unique position. As someone who had literally walked between both worlds during the Ghost Wolf ceremony, this man sacrificed his very humanity to protect our sacred ground, proving that courage and honor exist in every tribe, whether their skin is red or white. His example shows us that the true enemy is not each other, but the greed that would destroy everything sacred for temporary profit. Itzel stood and moved to the center of the lodge, carrying a beautifully decorated pipe that had been crafted specifically for this historic occasion. The pipe itself was a work of art that symbolized the blending of cultures, carved from red pipestone according to traditional methods, but decorated with silver work done by a white craftsman who had learned Indian techniques. "I propose that we establish not just a treaty, but a new kind of relationship between our peoples," she announced, her voice gaining strength as she outlined her vision. "Sacred sites will be protected by joint patrols of Indian warriors and white settlers, working together. Mining and development will be allowed in designated areas, but only with the consent of tribal authorities who understand which places hold spiritual significance." The proposal was revolutionary in its scope, suggesting a level of cooperation between Indians and whites that had never before been attempted on such a scale. But the events of the past week had demonstrated that traditional approaches to frontier conflicts were no longer adequate to address the complex realities of territorial expansion. Furthermore, Itzel continued, there will be economic partnerships that benefit both communities. Indian knowledge of the land, weather patterns, and natural resources will be shared with settler communities in exchange for access to white technology, medical knowledge, and trade networks. We will build prosperity together rather than fighting over the pieces of what we destroy. Judge Caldwell consulted quietly with the other federal representatives before responding to Itzel's proposal. The legal framework she was suggesting would require approval from territorial governments, federal authorities, and tribal councils, a complex process that could take months or even years to complete. The federal government is prepared to establish the Ponca Omaha Sacred Sites Protection Territory, he announced after several minutes of whispered consultation. This will be the first federally recognized zone where tribal spiritual authority takes precedence over mining and development interests. It will also serve as a testing ground for the cooperative governance model you have proposed. The announcement sent ripples of excitement and concern through the mixed assembly. Such a precedent would inevitably influence similar disputes across the frontier, potentially changing the entire relationship between Indian tribes and the expanding United States. But the most dramatic moment of the negotiations came when Garrett himself rose to address the gathering. His voice, still carrying subtle harmonics from his spiritual transformation, commanded immediate attention from everyone present. I came to this territory 15 years ago carrying nothing but grief and the desire to be left alone, he said, his words echoing strangely in the sacred space of the lodge. I thought that isolation could protect me from the pain of losing people I loved. But this family showed me that the only real protection comes from standing together, from choosing to care about something bigger than our own comfort. He turned to face Itzel and her children, his eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect both human wisdom and wolf-like wildness. The ghost wolf ceremony changed me in ways that can never be undone. I will always be partially a creature of the spirit world, never fully belonging to either the Indian or white communities. But perhaps that makes me the perfect guardian for the boundaries between them. Winter Bear nodded approvingly at Garrett's words, recognizing in them the acceptance of a sacred responsibility that few men would willingly choose. The spirits have given you a great gift and a great burden, the old shaman observed. You will serve as a bridge between worlds, helping others to cross safely when crossing becomes necessary. As the formal negotiations drew to a close, the various delegations began the process of drafting documents that would need to be ratified by their respective governments and tribal councils. The work would take weeks, but the essential framework for a new kind of frontier relationship had been established. Outside the lodge, Garrett found himself walking with Itzel and her children along the banks of the Niobrara River, watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in shades of gold and crimson. The events of the past week had aged all of them, but they had also forged bonds that would last for generations. What will you do now? Itzel asked, her hand finding his as they paused beside a grove of cottonwood trees. Your ranch still needs tending, but the treaty negotiations will require someone to serve as liaison between the communities. Garrett considered the question carefully, weighing his desire for a quiet life against the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders by forces beyond human understanding. The ghost wolf's influence would never completely fade, making him forever different from ordinary men. I think, he said slowly, that home isn't a place you go to escape from the world. It's a place you build with people who matter to you, regardless of what the world throws at you. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you build something new here, something that honors both our people's best traditions. Little Iana, who had been gathering wildflowers along the riverbank, suddenly ran to Garrett and wrapped her small arms around his legs. The grandfathers say your family now, she announced with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Different kind of family, but still family. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Nebraska territory, Garrett Stone realized that his long journey through grief and isolation had finally brought him home. not to the place he had lost, but to the place he had chosen to build a future where lonely ranchers and Ponca widows could work together to turn sorrow into joy, and where the spirits of the ancestors could rest peacefully in ground protected by the love of the living. The treaty that emerged from those historic negotiations would become known as the Singing Wolf Accords, establishing precedents for cooperative governance that would influence Indian-white relations across the American frontier for generations to come. But for the small family that had started it all, the most important victory was simpler. They had found each other in a harsh world, and they had chosen to stand together against whatever challenges the future might bring.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.